So what actually happens when one of the world's most powerful nations decides to take military action against another and captures its leader? Well, today we're going to unpack exactly that. We're looking at the global fallout from a recent strike in Venezuela and the massive international firestorm it kicked off. And really, that is the question at the heart of this whole thing. This isn't just about politics. It's about those invisible rules, the ones that are supposed to keep the world from spiraling into chaos. So when a major power just goes for it and acts alone, what's to stop the whole system from just unraveling? Let's dive in and find out. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to follow the shock waves of this event as they ripple outwards. First, we'll start right at ground zero with the strike itself. Then we'll zoom out to see how the world reacted, because boy, was it divided. After that, we'll look at the global rulebook that got thrown into question, hear from the countries right next door, and finally, we'll talk about the very real human cost of all this. All right, section 1. So first things first, let's get the basic facts straight. What exactly happened on the ground in Venezuela that set this whole global chain reaction into motion? Okay, here's what we know. On January 3rd, 2026, the United States conducted direct military strikes inside Venezuela. And the target, well, it was the country's leader, President Nicolás Maduro. And he was captured. I mean, this was a stunning move, a really audacious one. And it was this single action that sent those immediate shockwaves all across the planet. So, as you can imagine, the world's reaction was fast. But as the news started to break, it became incredibly clear that the international community was nowhere near being on the same page. In fact, it was completely split. Almost instantly, countries started falling into one of four camps. On one side, you had nations that flat out condemned the action. They called it illegal, a violation of the UN Charter, a total breach of sovereignty. Then you had this middle group that was calling for caution, basically saying, hey, let's slow down, get a legal review, find the facts before we all jump to conclusions. Then, of course, you had the supporters, who praised the action and framed it as a good thing for democracy. And finally, you had a few countries trying their best to stay neutral, just observing. I mean, this massive split just goes to show you how incredibly controversial this whole thing was from the get-go. But, this global split wasn't just about different opinions. It really cuts deeper. It's about the very rules that are supposed to keep the whole world in some kind of order. So to really get why the reactions were so fierce, we've got to take a look at what we're calling the global rulebook. And this quote right here, this is pretty much the core of the argument against the strike. It comes straight from the UN Charter Article 2.4. It says that all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against another state. It's basically the international version of you don't just invade another country. And for the critics, the US didn't just bend this rule, they completely shattered it. And really, this all boils down to one single incredibly important word: sovereignty. It's a simple but powerful idea. A country has the full right to govern itself without other countries interfering. So the argument from critics was pretty straightforward. By going in and capturing another nation's leader, the US had trampled all over this fundamental principle of global order. But beyond just this one event, there was a word that you kept hearing over and over again from world leaders and diplomats. And that word was precedent. So why did they keep using that word? What exactly was the dangerous precedent they were all so worried about? Well, here's how setting a precedent works and why it's so risky. It's a three-step process, really. Step 1, a powerful country takes a new kind of action that challenges an existing rule. Step 2, all the other nations have to decide. Do we accept this or do we reject it? And here's the kicker, step 3, if that action is accepted or even just not challenged, the old rule gets weaker for everyone, everywhere. The fear wasn't just about Venezuela. It was that this could open a Pandora's box for similar actions all over the globe. Okay, so we've seen the global picture. Now let's zoom in, way in, to the view from right next door. Because for the countries that actually share a border with Venezuela or are in the same neighborhood, this wasn't some abstract, high-level legal debate. No way. This was happening in their backyard. And what's interesting is that across Latin America, the response was really unified. And it's all shaped by a long and frankly painful history of foreign military interventions in the region. Their message was loud and clear: no more military solutions here. They pushed for elections, for diplomatic solutions, because they were deeply afraid that this one strike could be the spark that sets the entire region on fire. And this comparison really gets to the heart of two totally clashing worldviews. Look, for Latin American countries, the number one priority was regional stability. Their greatest fear was chaos and conflict spreading, so the method had to be non-intervention. But for many U.S. allies, the priority was promoting democracy. Their greatest fear was authoritarianism. So for them, the intervention was justified. It's a fundamental disagreement about what the bigger danger really is. So we've talked about geopolitics, we've talked about international law, but behind all of that high-level debate, it's easy to lose sight of something: the people. So for our final section, let's talk about the human cost, because it's very, very real. Because at its core, this whole debate is really about power. It's about what happens when a major power uses military force and what the consequences are for weaker states. And, most importantly, for the people, the civilians who live there. And if you look at history, you see this tragic pattern play out over and over again. It doesn't matter what the stated intention is, whether it's security, democracy, whatever. The analysis shows that these kinds of military interventions almost always have profound and destabilizing effects, especially on civilians. They are the ones left to deal with the aftermath. And that brings us to this really stark conclusion from the analysis of the global response. It says, military conquest and forced regime change are widely viewed as destabilizing and harmful. It's a pretty powerful sentence that really sums up the world's collective fear here. And it leaves us right back where we started with that big question. When a global power decides to break the rules, who exactly is there to stop them? And maybe more importantly, who ends up paying the price?